I'm Gautam Mukunda. Tonight on Greater Boston, with thousands of civilians killed so far in the latest war between Israel and Hamas, we'll take a look at the ethics and laws that govern armed conflicts. Plus, as the war in Israel and Gaza rages on, so does misinformation about it. Founder of the Ground Truth Project, Charlie Sennett, joins me on how these lies spread and how we can fight them. After landing for an historic and complicated trip to Israel, President Joe Biden pledged America's full, unwavering support for the country and announced billions of dollars in new aid. But he also cautioned Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu against unjust retaliation.
Justice must be done. But I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes. The vast majority of Palestinians are not Hamas. Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people.
More than 1,400 Israelis have been killed, mostly civilians who were murdered in the October 7th Hamas attack. And according to the UN, an estimated 4,200 people have been killed in Gaza, also mostly civilians, including many children, journalists, and medical staff. The first rule of just war is to avoid killing innocents. But beyond that, what are the laws of war, and how can they be applied and enforced in this conflict? To discuss, I'm joined by Father Bryan Hehir, former professor of religion and public life at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, who previously taught at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and Tom Dannenbaum, an associate professor of international law and co-director of the Center for International Law and Governance at Tufts. So, Father, let me begin with you. What are the obligations that international law puts on combatants in this kind of a war?
Well, I'd like to frame it as what the moral obligations are, because my partner in dialogue will take you through the international law. So the moral theory about the use of force essentially argues that some uses of force by the state to protect its population and territory is legitimate. But the question of what kind of force, for what purpose, and by what methods then spin out from there. So, for example, if you take the moral argument about the use of force, that theory gives you the basis to condemn the attack by Hamas as morally, humanly, and legally wrong. But that theory is also going to judge how Israel responds to this attack. And as you said, at the heart of the argument about methods of the use of force, the directly intended killing of civilians is always wrong. Civilians may die in a legitimate attack, but the directly intended targeting of civilians is always wrong. And even if you are not targeting civilians, the argument is that the act can be unjust if it is disproportionate in terms of the damage that it does. So purpose, method, intention don't directly tend to kill civilians, always wrong, and use proportionate force to effectively suppress injustice.
So, Tom, if that's the moral standards, then law is how we try to codify those moral standards. So how does international law try to constrain this kind of warfare, and how is it enforced, if at all?
The first thing to say is that one of the key premises of international law on these issues is to separate two legal questions. One is the resort to force in the first place, essentially whether we're going to war, and the other is the conduct once we're in a war. And those two are not just separate, they're also independent from one another. So the rules governing how to fight are held completely independent from the cause for which either party is fighting, and apply to both equally, and apply to both even if the other violates. And some of the key principles are to distinguish between civilians and combatants, between civilian objects and military objectives, to direct all military operations exclusively at military objectives, to take feasible precautions to minimize civilian harm, and to not engage in an attack when the collateral damage would be disproportionate, which is to say excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated, And in terms of enforcement, one of the most obvious mechanisms in this context is the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction over any war crimes perpetrated on the territory of Palestine, as the International Criminal Court understands it, which clearly includes Gaza, and also any war crimes perpetrated by nationals of Palestine, which would include actions on Israeli territory by Palestinian nationals.
So there's a key point that both of you agree on, but I want to emphasize it because I don't hear it at all in the discussion. Which, if I understood you both correctly, what you're saying is it doesn't matter how provoked you are. That does not justify taking retaliatory or even less retaliatory actions that are in violation of the principles that you laid out.
It does not change the rules.
And there's really an overlap between law and morality, not identity if you play them out fully, but the overlap. And the overlap on the directly intended killing of civilians, I would say, is pretty much absolute. We are in the same place on that. But then the question becomes, once you have, quotes, ruled out the directly intended killing of civilians, is there anything left that is to govern it? Proportionality is one thing. Intention has something to do. By intention, I mean, what is the logic that drives the policy? And so if one sort of just classifies a whole area as a target area, and it's a mix of civilians and non-civilians, you've got the wrong intention. Your intention has got to be to deal with those who have provided harm. Hamas qualifies for that. There's no Hamas as its military force. Hamas itself is a fairly complex reality. It's a military force, a political reality, and a social reality. And so it's woven through the society. It provides a very significant challenge for Israel to do what it legitimately has a right to do, which is to seek to prevent anything like this from happening again. But doing that is not going to be simple.
Yeah, the law codifies some of those same principles. For example, the presence of combatants within a civilian population, where that population is on aggregate civilians, and clearly the population of Gaza as a whole is a civilian population, does not change the civilian character of that population. So any military operation that is targeted at the population as a whole, such as a total siege on that population, is an operation that is targeted at a civilian population and therefore implicates law of war violations.
So, but to push on this, right? So, look, if you were a member of the IDF and trying to think through this, what you'd say is we're fighting people who don't wear uniforms, who are mixed into a population that, 2.2 million people, it's about the same population density as New York City. That's what we're talking about. That essentially there is, I think if I were to think what they'd say, there is no action we could take that would not harm civilians. So what would you counsel them they are allowed to do? What are the limits that they should be thinking about? And then,
well, I think the identification of Hamas as its military component is more and more trying to identify specifically, because it has provided a massive moral injustice that needs to be set right. So that's not wrong to seek to suppress that, both in the present and in the future. But it was interesting that Secretary Blinken's advice to them was, to Israel, you must win, but the question is how you win makes a difference. And what comes into play, not just for Israel, but for any state, is the question of legitimacy in the minds of people watching. I think it is important to indicate that the United States faced this problem and didn't face it very well in parts of World War II. Obliteration bombing in Europe, we had a perfect just cause to prevent the Nazi domination of Europe. We did not have a just cause to do obliteration bombing across the city, where you would have the mix of civilians and combatants joined tightly.
I would say two things. One is on that kind of attack, the law has developed significantly since World War II, and so where some of those attacks were at least open to legal question at that time, they would be very clearly unlawful today as indiscriminate attacks, or alternatively attacks on a civilian population depending on the precise context. The second thing is with respect to the difficulty of targeting Hamas fighters. That is obviously a complication that the IDF faces. At the same time, it's important to remember that the protections are for human beings. Those human beings here are, in the context of IDF attacks on Hamas targets, the civilians of Gaza. And what ought not be the case is that a violation by Hamas fighters, either of the prohibition on using human shields or on the prohibition of perfidious killing, where they're presenting as civilians in order to facilitate their activity, is a harm to the civilians of Gaza as well as a harm to the IDF. And the IDF should not be unrestrained from its obligations vis-a-vis those civilians simply because they have themselves, the civilians have themselves been a victim of the violation by Hamas of using human shields or otherwise endangering the civilian population. So the key thing is not to lose sight of the fact that the protections are for them and they're not the ones who are engaged in the violation to which this is a response.
I think a point to be made in this discussion is the journey from World War II until today. Civilians were targeted and killed on all sides in World War II, and it did not create a great uproar around that fact. The fact today that the targeting of civilians becomes a major issue in this very tragic conflict that is interesting in itself, that the general public understands this discourse, I think, in general terms, in a way that was not the case in World War II.
So how then, in a conflict in which, I mean, the initial blows, at least of this go-around, right, had no limitations about ethics or national law. I think I suspect the pushback President Biden got when he said you have to is that you're restraining us but not our enemies. What would you tell Benjamin Netanyahu if you had the chance to speak with him about why he should listen to what you just said?
Everybody thinks that their side is in the right. Everybody over-indexes on the violations of the adversary. And so to see violations by the adversary as a basis for acting without restraint in response is a path to total war on both sides.
Yeah, I think the question of legitimacy fits in here. And what I mean by legitimacy is not only legal legitimacy or moral legitimacy, but legitimacy in the mind of people who are trying to make sense out of this conflict. And what I would say to Mr. Netanyahu, if I had the chance, which I never will, is to say, keep in mind that not only the objective you seek is legitimate, but the way you do it can influence in the mind of a wider general public what's at stake. Now, we can't even talk to Hamas about that. There wouldn't be much sense in trying to talk to Hamas. So to some degree, it's an unequal burden that the Israelis face precisely because of what they profess and have professed for a long time, that they abide by these rules. He has to think not only about the objective, I think, but also the method and then the consequences as this is perceived in the wider international and national community.
Thank you. On that note, Bryan, since you said I should, and Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
In the fog of war, social media can spread important updates about the violence and the people caught up in it. But as we've already begun to see in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, it can spread dangerous misinformation too. Take the explosion at a hospital in Gaza City yesterday, which Palestinian officials blamed on an Israeli airstrike, a story that spread like wildfire on social media. But Israel blames a failed rocket launch by the militant group Palestinian Islamic Jihad, And President Joe Biden says U.S. intelligence appears to back up Israel's claims. So how can we differentiate the truth from fiction? To discuss, I'm joined by Charlie Sennett, founder of the Ground Truth Project, the home of the Report for America initiative. Charlie, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
So, Charlie, you reported for the Middle East for many years. Tell us what it's like to report a fast-breaking news story like this one in the region.
You know, I think the truth is hard work. To get the truth on the ground amid the tensions, the violence, the emotions that are running so high in Israel, of course, and also, of course, in Gaza. All I can say is it's extremely difficult. You know, the famous axiom of war, that the first casualty of war is the truth, really feels relevant in these very moments. And I would tell you, I remember being a reporter there, based there for the Boston Globe for many years, and when you're on the scene of a bombing, the emotion and this incredible sense of the loss of innocent lives is really heavy. And I'll never forget the first day I arrived at work in Jerusalem in 1997. It was one of the big bus bombings in the markets. And the first image I ever saw was the hand of a young girl with blue nail polish underneath a partial tarp. She had just been covered up. She was gone. She was dead. And the remnants of the blast were just there. It was very immediate aftermath, walking on crushed glass. You feel it. It's very intense. It's very hard to get at what is accurate. But eventually what we learned was that was a Hamas bombing. That was one of the really big bus bombings. And I think about that. I think about what Hamas has become, where that all went, how the peace process fell apart. These shards, these incredible shards that just blow apart in a scene like this terrific terrorist, you know, or accidental, we'll find out, strike that happened at the hospital is almost unfathomable to imagine. So I feel for, of course, everyone, the killed, those who are there trying to figure it out. I also really feel for the journalists on the ground and the pressure and the tension and the effort to get it right. And I know there are really good journalists there on the ground trying to do that.
So far too many people are going to have the experience that you just described, and have had it and will have it in the next few weeks. So as we think about what happened with this story, I mean, something clearly went very, very wrong, with a viral claim about 500 casualties going all around the world that seems to have been walked back. Now we don't have a number. We don't really know who did it, although the evidence seems to be leaning towards a misfire missile. To the extent that we know, what do you think went wrong here?
Look, I don't know. And I think that's maybe the biggest thing I learned in covering the Middle East is you don't know what you know until you really know it. And we certainly saw that in the immediate aftermath of this. It was immediately blamed on Israel. It does look like the early intelligence, and I'm interested that U.S. officials keep calling it preliminary. So I think we need to hear that. We need to think about that. But overhead imagery, open source, and intercepts would indicate that this is indeed an accidental strike by Islamic Jihad. They were launching a rocket. The rocket misfired. It came down into a place they didn't intend it to, which appears to be the parking lot of the hospital. And that has caused a lot of deaths. It's caused a lot of injuries. And as you say, we don't know the number. But that seems to be what happened. But I guess in terms of what do you learn covering the Middle East, keep working hard, keep staying right on it, stay on the ground, keep trying to dig for what you know, and only report what you know.
So, I mean, I hope that that's guidance, and obviously we had it here where a summit that was meant to get humanitarian relief to the Palestinians has been canceled because of the reports. And then let me then build on this last set of questions, right? So when the stakes are this high,
yes,
at the same time, when all the eyes of the world, right, all the commercial incentives are to sort of go for clicks, there's got to be an enormous amount of pressure to get the story right first.
Right.
And the cost of, when the cost of getting it wrong might be paid far down the line. What's your suggestion to reporters about how to, sort of how to push back against that, get the eyes and do their job and get the story right?
I think we have to push back against the machine and all the algorithms that want to keep driving us to go faster and faster in our reporting. Like I said, this is an ancient axiom of war from ancient Greece that said, first casualty of war is the truth. Now the difference, the thing that makes it feel so much worse now is the veracity, just how the velocity and voraciousness of lies now move at just incalculable speeds. We've never had it like this before, where in an instant, the whole world is told something that could be wrong. Journalists need to know that. They need to know that the work they do when they carefully write a lead like a New York Times reporter would, or they carefully lead a broadcast like the NewsHour would, that even when you're tweeting or you're working in social media, that's the same standards and practices of get it right. And you have to bring that. And we work with a lot of journalists who are sort of next generation journalists, and we work with journalists around the world and through Report for America. And we are really trying to teach that your social media is an extension of your actual journalism. So I would say that's the key. I'd say in the moment we live in, right now, what I'm worried about is that these days we live in what I would call a post-truth era. It's a phrase that's been coined, it's used a lot, but what it really means is a time when emotions and ideologies supersede discernible facts. That's post-truth, and that's a horrifying era, and we're in it. And social media has a lot to answer for how we got here. But I think journalists have an opportunity and an obligation to get it right now and to get back to the basics, to the good old-fashioned journalism of get there on the ground and do your best to report what you know.
So this is the issue on which there's probably more pressure, where essentially any statement you make will get one side or the other, or possibly both, going after you as evidence of bias. I'll say, of anything I've ever talked about, this is the one where I am most careful about what I say for exactly that reason.
Yep.
And how do you tell how do you personally deal with, and how do you tell reporters to deal with that fact that essentially there are people whose entire organizational initiative is to go after you, to work the refs, as it were?
It's a great question, and I don't know that I have any advice that's going to really help. But I do know I feel that sense of caution, and I would add it's good caution. It's a complex place. It's a long history. How you understand the moment we're in has to begin with how you define the history and where you begin your definitions of that history. You go back to the Holocaust, you go back to the very early days of the Israeli state and the way Palestinians were pushed out of these areas. Most of the refugees in Gaza are from the 1948 lines. Do you go back to 67 and do you go back to the, this is the moment? Or do you go back to the peace process that was once so hopeful that now seems truly shattered and in shards on the ground with all of the destruction that has happened in both Israel with the attack by Hamas, which we need to begin with in this recent episode, and then now with the horrific loss of life in the retaliatory strikes by Israel. I think Biden had it right. This is President Biden at his best. He's a very emotional guy. He's a healer, and he loves to comfort people. And I think seeing him stay very clearly, we need to stand with Israel, is the right thing. I think seeing him turn the corner to say we also need to tell Israel, like our brothers, you can't let the rage consume your judgment. Secretary of Defense Austin put it really well when he said, "This is a time for resolve, not revenge." And I think we play a role in that. I think we also have to be really quick to say, not only do we support Israel, we also support the peace process, which this country did so much to give shape to, and to pull the two sides together. And we need to remind them both that peace process feels a very, very long way away. But the goal has to be, we have to think toward peace.
So I mean, it was striking to see President Biden say, we were enraged after 9/11. Don't make our mistakes.
That was incredible. A very self-effacing moment.
And so when I think about that, right, he's trying to put things in a context. He's trying to exercise empathy, right? A sort of a famous Biden strength.
Right.
But he's also trying to do what you just said, put things in a context so that we understand so that we can understand the history of the moment and things like that. And I always tell my students there's a cheat code in my class, right? That if you don't know the answer, you can always say, it depends on context, and you'll be right. For you, it seems to me what you're saying is in the Middle East, that's more true than anywhere else. Everything depends on the context. In a world of 30-second sound bites, how do you work with reporters to help them to be able to put things in a context that goes back 5,000 years?
In this news cycle, I've been really struggling with that because there's so much breaking news, there's so much immediacy. We're not stopping to really think about how we got here. And I do think we need to find forums, and this show is a great one. This place, WGBH, right here, PBS, I think it's the best shot we have to find that sense of an ability to have context. I think the New York Times has brought a lot of history forward, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to learn online right now and understand this is a very complicated, layered history. Both sides have suffered greatly. And in this moment, right now, yes, it begins with condemning an incredibly barbaric attack by Hamas, but we also have to care about the loss of innocent lives among Palestinians as they're underneath this rubble now caused by the airstrikes coming from Israel.
If the context is that important to you need a depth to really understand the issues and the people involved,
Yeah.
what's the book you would tell our listeners to read?
Beirut to Jerusalem by our friend.
So you took the one I was going to recommend, Beirut to Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think it is probably the single best book in this moment in particular to think about and to go through as you really look at that. And that is, it stands as a way to understand the moment. I do think some of the books about the peace process are important because the expansion of settlements and how they undercut the peace process and created the despair is important. Hamas, we have to remember, was elected in 2006, I believe it is.
Yeah.
But before that, they were very small. They were almost out of business. The Israelis and Palestinians were working together until Bibi Netanyahu's cabinet tried to kill Mashal, the political officer. That really propelled Hamas into a new level of engagement with the community, especially in Gaza. Layer upon layer, I think Beirut to Jerusalem, Tom Friedman's book, takes us so far, but it's really important to understand how the peace process unraveled. And I think actually there's some self-effacing moment for the United States to think about, did we do enough to make sure that peace process worked? And I think the clear answer in the moment we're in is no, we did not.
On that note, Charlie, I'm sure that's not the last time we'll be talking about this. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Gautam Mukunda, and thanks for watching. Good night.
Growing up,